The stanzas which begin with the line, "and did those feet in ancient time," are among the most famous that William Blake ever wrote. Better known as the hymn Jerusalem, they were set to music by the composer Sir Hubert Parry in 1916.
And did those feet in ancient time walk upon England's mountain stream, and was the holy Lamb of God on England's pleasant pastures seen, and did the countenance divine shine forth upon unguarded hills, and was Jerusalem builded here among these dark satanic hills? Bring me my burning gold, bring me my arrows of desire, bring me my spear, O clouds unfold, bring me my chariot of fire. I will not cease from mental fight, nor shall my sword sleep in my hand, till we have built Jerusalem in England's free and pleasant land.
In this episode of Visionary, we'll be exploring the history and meaning of the stanzas from William Blake's preface to Milton, throwing some light on the legends that have grown around this poem, and looking how it came to be set to music by Sir Hubert Parry. The poem that would become the hymn Jerusalem was first engraved by Blake in 1804 as part of a preface to his long epic Milton a Poem. This work, the first copies of which Blake printed in 1811, was intended as a correction of the religious and political ideas of the poet John Milton, who had long been a profound influence on Blake's own art and writings. Blake's strange and complex epic begins with Milton unhappy in heaven, slowly coming to realise that in his ambition to create a perfect Puritan afterlife, he has cast off fundamental sexual and spiritual relations with his feminine emanation, and that he has also refused to acknowledge his responsibility for creating Satan, the ultra-masculine spectre and shadow of his own dark desires. In the immediate context of Blake's stanzas, however, the preface provides a much simpler manifesto for the Romantic poet's critique of England's most famous epic poet. As we shall see, this prologue is unique at the time as an attack on the influence of classical literature, and its clear anti-war message would probably surprise many singers of the hymn who assume that the vow to not cease from mental fight is a call to arms. Yet why was Blake compelled to write such a pacifist message? Much of the answer comes from the circumstances in which the stanzas were written. Between 1800 and 1803, Blake, the great Londoner, spent the only extensive period of his life outside the capital. When he and Catherine moved to the small Sussex village of Felpham to be close to the poet and man of letters who would be his new patron, William Hayley, thus he embarked on a new life. Hayley was a respected poet of the day who had taken a house at Felpham to enjoy the new pastime of sea bathing. While his poetry is not much read these days, he was one of the most important scholars of his time, working on Milton in particular, and Blake was introduced to him by a mutual friend, John Flaxman, who had known Hayley since the 1780s. Many of Blake's acquaintances rejoiced at this new opportunity for the engraver. Life in the capital had become increasingly hostile for anyone critical of the government, as Blake had been during the 1790s. and the ongoing war with France was causing difficulties for the book trade on which Blake relied for a living. William and Catherine certainly saw the move as a blessing, and as he wrote to his friend Thomas Butts, "If I should ever build a palace, it would be only my cottage enlarged." The idyll, however, soon began to turn sour. While the cottage may have seemed heavenly to William at first, its dampness made Catherine increasingly ill. Likewise, whatever promises Hayley held for Blake, the patron could be both officious and controlling of his protégé. While these things created difficulties, along with the fact that work for an artist was often hard to come by, true disaster struck on the 12th of August 1803. The Treaty of Amiens, signed on the 25th of March 1802, had provided a temporary ceasefire between the United Kingdom and France. This uneasy truce was ended in May 1803 when the British declared war on France, having become increasingly alarmed at Napoleon's reordering of Europe and his potential threat to the UK's overseas colonies. Over the coming months, the south coast of England would become one of the most heavily militarised parts of Europe, as soldiers were billeted in towns and villages along the English Channel to see off a threatened invasion by Bonaparte. One such soldier, stationed at the Fox Inn in Felpham, was to change Blake's life. On Friday the 12th of August, John Schofield was invited into the Blake's garden as an assistant to a gardener working there. Blake, having noticed the stranger, came out to talk to him, during which time their conversation became rather heated. The engraver provided an account to his friend Butts a few days later.
I desired him as politely as was possible to go out of the garden. He made me an impertinent answer. I insisted on his leaving the garden. He refused. I still persisted in desiring his departure. He then threatened to knock out my eyes. It affronted my foolish pride. I therefore took him by the elbow and pushed him till I had got him out. There I intended to have left him, but he turning about put himself into a posture of defiance, threatening and swearing at me. I, perhaps foolishly and perhaps not, stepped out at the gate and took him again by the elbows and pushed him forwards down the road about 50 yards, he all the while endeavouring to turn round and strike me and raging and cursing, which drew out several neighbours. My landlord compelled the soldiers to go indoors after many abusive threats against me and my wife from the two soldiers, but not one word of threat on account of sedition was uttered at that time. This method of revenge was planned between them after they had got together into the stable. This is the whole outline.
This was not to be the end of it. Having been rudely deposited at the nearby Fox Inn, Schofield then returned with another soldier, John Cox, and accused Blake of sedition. At his trial in Chichester the following year, Blake was acquitted, and it was clear that Schofield was an untrustworthy witness, although, as Blake's friend and patron John Linnell observed many years later, it was very likely that Blake had, indeed, damned the king. Whatever the truth of the events in August 1803, it was clear that Blake was both shaken and more confirmed than ever in his opposition to all forms of militarism, a belief that he held on to ever more firmly when writing the preface to Milton, a poem. These, then, are the circumstances in which Blake came to engrave his preface with his famous 4 stanzas. The preface itself outlines an attack on the leading figures of the day who support corporeal war and oppose mental fight. And Blake makes it quite clear that he blames the classical education which celebrated the traditional epics of Homer and Virgil as responsible for making England an un-Christian country. A common assumption of the more famous poem is that it refers to Jesus visiting pre-Roman Britain, having been brought here before the island's conquest by the Emperor Claudius through his supposed uncle Joseph of Arimathea, who visited the ancient Britons in order to trade for tin. The attribution of Christ's feet in England, however, as with the dark satanic mills of the Industrial Revolution, are interpretations that have only gradually developed over time. Turning first to Jesus visiting England, one of the problems for Blake's poem is that our first evidence of this legend comes from the 1890s, long after Blake had died. Blake does not refer to the feet of the boy Jesus, but he does seem to have believed that Joseph of Arimathea came to ancient Britain. This visit was the subject of one of Blake's first engravings, Joseph of Arimathea among the Rocks of Albion, completed in 1773, and he returned to it in his 1794 painting, Joseph of Arimathea preaching to the Britons. The legend that Joseph came to Britain was a long-standing one. In the 12th century, William of Malmesbury had written that Joseph had led 12 disciples who came to this island and founded its oldest church, that of St. Mary's at Glastonbury. Blake's own source appears to have been Milton's The History of Britain. Writing of the decision that's to send 2 religious doctors to convert the ancient Britons, Milton remarked that Joseph of Arimathea was said to have first preached the Christian faith in this island. Blake then seems to have been inspired by the legend of Joseph arriving to preach the Christian gospel in Britain after Christ's death, rather than by any notion that the young Jesus was brought along as part of a trading expedition. If Blake had ever thought that the historical Jesus had accompanied his putative uncle to the British Isles, he would certainly have made that connection more explicit. The opening stanzas, then, are an assertion that before British history began to be recorded, Joseph of Arimathea, a follower of Christ, had travelled to the island to establish Christianity. This is the Jerusalem to which Blake refers, the city of God, as St. Augustine would have had it, rather than the historical city of the Holy Land. Preaching there, early converts would have been made aware of the life and words of the Lamb of God and seen with prophetic vision the divine face of God. For an artist who regularly mocked crass literalism and instead praised poetic imagination, the notion that Blake believed that Jesus came to Britain and inspired some kind of literal building of an imitation Jerusalem is nonsense. To be fair, the notion that Joseph of Arimathea also came and preached the gospel on the edge of the Roman Empire is equally nonsensical, as Milton recognised in his history. But at least Blake was in good company with many antiquarians of his day in holding this belief. What then of that other famous phrase, dark satanic mills? This is usually interpreted by being transposed to the cotton mills of northern England that began to appear in the late 18th century, or, with slightly better chance of success, the Albion flour mills built in Southwark by Samuel Wyatt in 1786. Such connections to Britain's Industrial Revolution, however, only really began to gain ground in the 1830s. The textile industry of the North was far from Blake, and he must have particularly despised the prospect of industrial flour production to have recalled one specific factory which had been burned to the ground in 1791 when writing his own poem in 1804. Other critics view it more successfully as a reference to the English Church or as a critique of English academies and their emphasis on empiricism, or to the militarisation of the country as it fought with France in the 1790s. In their own way, each of these interpretations is much more effective than the association with the Industrial Revolution. Had Blake lived a little longer and written his stanzas later, he would almost certainly have viewed the economic events of the 19th century with the same gloominess as Charles Dickens or Emile Zola. Where the phrase comes from, however, is made clear in the poem itself. Where the starry mills of Satan are built beneath the earth and waters of the mundane shell, here the 3 classes of men take their sexual texture woven. The sexual is threefold, the human is fourfold. The dark satanic mills of Satan are the metaphorical wheels of the universe, the starry mills which grind down men's souls, whether through harsh philosophy and religion or greed and the desire for war. Against the grinding of human souls at Satan's mill, then, the invocation of Joseph of Arimathea's preaching the gospel in Rome and Britain serves for Blake as both historical event and also a theological vision of Christianity brought to the inhabitants of the island. The series of images that follows, with bows of burning gold, arrows of desire and a chariot of fire, has rightly attracted the attention of generations of readers and are astonishing. The last image is particularly startling, drawing upon the chariot that was used by Elijah and which has indicated he was doing God's work in 2 Kings. And it came to pass, as they still went on and talked, that behold, there appeared a chariot of fire and horses of fire, and parted them both asunder, and Elijah went up by a whirlwind and into heaven. In Blake's poem, the narrator is filled with the confidence that he will be able to build the symbol of God's will on earth, the city of Jerusalem in England's green and pleasant land. The most famous lines from the preface to Milton serve then as an act of public prophecy, one which is deeply concerned with the status of the arts at the beginning of the 19th century. Blake condemns the traditions of Greco-Roman classicism, which he associates with the celebration of war and destruction, instead figuring himself as one of that nation of prophets which he wished to see England become, just as Moses praised the ancient Hebrews who, fleeing Egypt, were inspired to speak God's words as they sought the promised land. Blake's personal virulence against militarism, which had been a lifelong feature of his work, was given greater emphasis following the experience of his trial for sedition. And the call of the lines "and did those feet" should be seen as part of a wider invocation of the arts to rouse up the creative powers of the country. Blake's political purpose was to argue that Joseph of Arimathea did indeed visit ancient Britain, but that this example of divine and manifest destiny placed a greater burden upon the citizens of Albion to build Jerusalem in England as an act of peace amidst the horrors of the Napoleonic Wars. Blake wrote his original words with the full intention of contributing to the national debate as a pacifist. His cry was an appeal to the young men of the New Age to turn against the lustful war of their supposed superiors, to create rather than to destroy. It was a cause of great sadness to Blake that no one heard his message, nor would they have the opportunity to do so until several decades after his death in 1827. While few people read those words during his lifetime, 100 years later they would become known as his most famous poem, when the composer Sir Hubert Parry set them to music as the hymn Jerusalem in 1916 during the Great War. Between Blake's death in 1827, however, and Parry's own musical arrangement in 1916, there were several other editors, writers and composers who were influential in shaping how Blake's works came to be seen as a vision of English patriotism. The rediscovery of Blake's stanzas from Milton were, as with so much else of his work, one of the products of Alexander Gilchrist's famous biography of Blake, first published in 1868. Like many other Victorians, however, Gilchrist did not really understand the meaning of Blake's poem and passed over it quickly. The transformation of "and did those feet" into an emblem of patriotic verse owed much more instead to another Victorian, Henry Charles Beeching. Beeching, who lived between 1859 and 1919, was a clergyman educated at Oxford and who began work in a Liverpool parish after taking orders in 1882. Alongside his pastoral work, like many other clergymen, he also pursued more literary studies, publishing his first collection, Love in Idleness, in 1883. Beeching took an interest in Blake's poetry and included selections in his anthology A Paradise of English Poetry in 1893. Beeching's anthology reprints Blake's stanzas without any title as the second poem in his selection of patriotism after a medley drawn from Shakespeare's famous Sceptred Isle speech by John of Gaunt in the play Richard II. In a later edition, he gave it the title The New Jerusalem. But if it was Beeching who laid the foundations of what would become Jerusalem, much more important was the composer Henry Walford Davies, who, along with Robert Bridges, was one of the most influential figures to inspire Parry to compose the hymn Jerusalem. Born in Oswestry, Shropshire in 1869, Walford Davis's father was a keen amateur musician who founded a choral society in the town and inspired his children to follow his musical aspirations. Henry, who began his own musical career as a chorister and then organist at St George's Chapel, Windsor, studied at the Royal College of Music until 1894. While at the Royal College, he met with Parry, who taught him for a semester, establishing what was to become the beginning of mutual respect between the two men. After leaving the Royal College, Walford Davis worked at the Temple Church in London, where he began to achieve his greatest musical prominence, most notably for a cantata Everyman composed in 1904 and based on the 15th century morality play, achieving the levels of prestige that would eventually lead to his appointment as Master of the King's Music. Part of his role in instigating Parry to compose Jerusalem came from the fact that he was the composer who first set and did those feet to music in 1907, alongside two other pieces of poetry by Shakespeare and Arthur Hugh Clough. Entitled England's Pleasant Land and published by Sidney Reardon in 1908, Walford Davis wrote in his preface to the score that the pieces were specially written for the Morecambe Festival of 1908, all of them intended for a soprano, alto, tenor and bass choir. It was the poet laureate Robert Bridges who suggested that Hubert Parry should write suitable, simple music to Blake's stanzas, music that an audience could take up and join in. Bridges and Parry had been friends since their time together at Eton, yet it was certainly more than mere friendship that motivated Bridges to turn to the composer. Sir Charles Hubert Hastings Parry, born in Bournemouth in 1848, was distinguished amongst his contemporaries, having established his reputation during the 1880s at the many choral festivals that took place in England, as well as joining the staff of the Royal College of Music at its founding in 1893. He succeeded Sir George Grove as its director 11 years later. In 1900, he became Professor of Music at Oxford and was knighted and made a baronet towards the end of his life for his service to music. Yet within a few years of his death in 1918, his work was, aside from a few songs, including Jerusalem, largely forgotten. One reason was that Parry had turned late to music as a career and was sometimes viewed by less knowledgeable contemporaries as little more than an amateur than a professional. In addition, Parry's academic and musical careers were not always harmonious, and composition alone brought little financial gain. By 1900, Parry complained that in 20 years he had only earned £25 from his compositions. With Jerusalem, however, he was to create something that would outlast all his other work. The immediate cause that led Bridges to ask Parry to set the poem to music was for a meeting of the Fight for Right movement, which had been established by Sir Francis Younghusband during the war. Following the outbreak of the war, the Bishop of Winchester had suggested that the words to the English national anthem be changed to make them more inspiring to the troops. Bridges disliked the tune of God Save the King, which he considered to be of German origin, and while hoping that Parry would write the music, he first suggested that George Butterworth would undertake the task, were Parry unwilling. Butterworth, who had set A.E. Houseman's A Shropshire Lad to music, joined the armies of privates at the outbreak of war, but was killed in the Battle of the Somme in August 1916. Thus it was Parry who came to write the piece for Fight for Right, the movement itself devoted to espousing the patriotic cause of the Allies against Germany. Its first performance was at the Queen's Hall on March 28, 1916, at an event organised by Younghusband's movement. Destroyed during the Second World War, Queen's Hall was a concert hall in Langham Place that had been designed by the artist Thomas Knightley and which had opened in 1893. The home of two orchestras, the BBC Symphony Orchestra and the London Philharmonic Orchestra, it was known as the musical centre of the empire, where composers such as Elgar and Claude Debussy had performed. At the Fight for Right event, Bridges explained, "I asked my friend Sir Hubert Parry to compose a setting of Blake's poem for us. He has done so, and we shall hear it tonight for the first time." Parry's composition was sung by 300 members of the main choirs of London, as well as several professional singers. Walford Davis was the conductor, and his singers also performed his piece O England, modelled to thy inward greatness, from his collection England's Pleasant Land, as well as other pieces by Parry, Elgar and Handel. In addition to the musical performances, there were a number of speakers, including the trade unionist W. Appleton, who instructed his audience on the willingness of British workers to sacrifice their lives for the greater good. Despite this apparently auspicious first performance, however, Parry disliked the jingoism of Fight for Right and within months had withdrawn his permission from them to perform it. Parry's wife, Lady Maud, had long been friends with Millicent Fawcett, leader of the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies formed in 1897, which, unlike the Women's Social and Political Union formed by Emmeline Pankhurst in 1903, tended to operate more through political campaigning and leafleting rather than more direct political action. Lady Maud had been visiting suffragist meetings since the 1890s, and Parry's own role was more than that of a casual bystander. On the 17th of March 1917, he conducted Jerusalem for a women's demonstration meeting at the Albert Hall and allowed it to be performed almost exactly a year later on 13th of March as part of a suffrage demonstration concert. Whereas he had withdrawn his support from young husbands, such was his friendship to Millicent Fawcett and admiration for her cause, that before his death he passed the copyright for Jerusalem to the Women's Suffrage Society. It was to be almost one of the last acts of his life. Having left his home at Heinz for London in 1918 and then travelling on to Rustington in West Sussex, Parry began to succumb to symptoms in late August and early September of what would later be diagnosed as Spanish flu, although his actual death on October the 7th was due to blood poisoning. Parry was well respected for his ability to set poetry to music, and in Jerusalem the effect is a remarkable harmony of the poet's word and the composer's music. On the night of its first performance in 1916, the members of Young Husbands movement must have believed that this was truly the song to inspire a nation. And yet, within months, Parry had removed his support from Fight for Right. One biographer observed that Jerusalem was suggested for one movement and claimed for another. Yet over the next century it would become regarded as his finest piece of music, in the process making Blake's original obscure poem one of his most famous.